Hey, 42 here. Social media is a dark and seductive place that can swallow you whole if you're not careful. Everywhere you look, someone's living a life that seems far brighter and more colourful than your own. It's amazing how much time you can spend scrolling through photos of people you met once at a wedding and haven't spoken to since. And given how long most of us spend using our phones in the loo these days, it's a miracle our friends and family aren't pushing to have us medically assessed. Actually, they probably haven't even noticed because they're too busy on their phones too. One of my favourite things about social media are all those nauseating inspirational quotes. The ones that teach you to enjoy the journey, not the destination. Or to realise that today is a gift. That's why it's called the present. Then there's dance like nobody's watching. Love like you've never been hurt. Definitely a contender for the most overused quote ever pasted onto a beach background. From what I can tell, they're usually posted by individuals who give a particularly large damn about what other people think. And when they really want to drive the point home, they'll attach a video of themselves dancing as if nobody else is watching, presumably in the desperate hope that millions of people will indeed watch. That's more ironic than 10,000 spoons when all you need is a knife. Okay, that's not ironic at all, but let's not get started with that one. Where was I? Yes, exhibitionist dancers. And in this class, there was one man who stood head and tiaras above the rest. Henry Cyril Paget, the 5th Marquess of Anglesey, also known as the Dancing Marquess, was a man truly ahead of his time. In an era when members of the British aristocracy were expected to behave like perfect stoic gentlemen, with upper lips so stiff you could chop onions on them, Pip, Henry Paget was, well, not that. No, he was a dress-wearing, hip-wriggling, blue steel posing, jewel-encrusted exhibitionist. A real showman whose life was as fascinating as it was short. This is the story of one of history's most colourful, forgotten characters. A man who defied every expectation of his class and era in order to be exactly who he wanted to be, no matter the cost. Henry was born on the 16th of June 1875 to the 4th Marquess of Anglesey and his second wife, Blanche Mary Boyd. There were whispers that Henry's biological father was actually renowned French actor Benoit Constant Coquelin, and considering the love of the stage that would later dominate Henry's life, that seems plausible. Tragically, when Henry was 2 years old, his mother passed away, and he was sent to Paris to be raised in the Coquelin household, further fueling those rumours about the identity of his father. Henry was to live in Paris until the age of 8, when he returned to his ancestral home on the island of Anglesey. Even at such a young age, he was said to be very different to his peers, and not just due to a love of smelly cheese he'd picked up in France. A somewhat lonely childhood followed, spent mainly in the company of a nanny and the many dogs which belonged to the estate, before Henry's stereotypical aristocratic upbringing was completed with, surprise surprise, an education at Eton. In 1898, aged 23, Henry ticked the next box on the blue blood checklist by marrying his cousin, Lillian Chetwynd. In October of the same year, his father passed away, making Henry the 5th Marquess of Anglesey and one of the wealthiest men in Britain. The family home and estates covered around 30,000 acres in various parts of the UK and were valued at £535,000, somewhere north of £70 million in today's money. Oh, and there is also the small matter of his annual income of approximately £120,000, £16 million today. Just think about that for a moment. £16 million a year. That's more than £1.3 million a month. Most people would struggle to get through that kind of money, even if they were really trying. But Henry was certainly not most people. In fact, spending money may well have been his true calling. Because, despite this almost unfathomable wealth, in fewer than 6 years, he would be bankrupt. At this point in the video, I thought about going through a hypothetical list of all the things you could buy for that squandered cash. But Henry's real list of excessive spending doesn't really need any spicing up. For starters, he bought the content of an entire jewellery shop in Paris for his new wife whilst they were on their honeymoon. The story goes that Henry asked his bride to pose wearing the jewels and nothing else. Kind of like every teenage boy's favourite scene in Titanic, only without the token artwork. Henry marvelled at the glittering diamonds, emeralds and sapphires covering his wife's body. But before you get the wrong idea, there certainly weren't any pearl necklaces on show. The marriage was apparently never consummated, and Lillian requested its annulment in 1900. Freed from the constraints of matrimony, Henry threw himself headlong into his real passions: theatre and unadulterated self-indulgence. The family chapel on the estate was refurbished to become a 150-seat theatre called the Gaiety, and Henry formed a theatre company, poaching actors from another touring group with promises of substantially more pay. Naturally, Henry cast himself as the lead in pretty much every production, but hogging the spotlight wasn't quite enough to satisfy his narcissistic tendencies. He wanted to shine in every possible way. Costumes for his lavish productions cost eye-watering sums. Apparently, he'd never heard of costume jewellery, and he frequently commissioned bespoke pieces from leading costumiers, including a diamond-encrusted outfit for a production of Aladdin that cost £10,000, more than £1.3 million today. Sadly, that very same Aladdin costume was left unattended in a changing room, and, shock, horror, never seen again. Not one to dwell on the negatives in life, Henry simply had another one made. The stolen Aladdin outfit wasn't the only time Henry was relieved of some of his bling. In 1901, his valet was charged with theft, pocketing over £2 million worth of Henry's jewels. It's fair to say that Henry was spending money faster than Mike Tyson on a cocaine bender. But he was so incredibly rich that to bring about full-on bankruptcy, he was going to have to get creative. And oh my, the lengths Henry would go to achieve self-imposed financial ruin were insane. For starters, he owned a fleet of expensive motor cars, one of which was modified to pump perfume out of its exhaust. Yet another of his cars was modelled on a luxury train carriage, complete with revolving chairs, solid silver fittings, and cherubs carved into the wood-panelled ceiling. Henry was delighted by all things glittering and ostentatious, so when he decided he wanted a green ping-pong jacket, it naturally had to be made out of emeralds. Don't worry, I had no idea a ping-pong jacket was a thing either. Considering Henry's flamboyant persona, failed marriage, fabulous tastes, and risque outfits, there was widespread speculation about his sexuality. Not that Henry really gave a bejazzled hoot. The more people talked, the more outrageous he became. During the intervals of his shows, he'd perform what was known as the butterfly dance, a habit that earned him the title the Dancing Marquess. The dance was based on one made famous by American actress Louis Fuller, during which a billowing silk gown would be used to create movements reminiscent of a butterfly spreading its wings and flying. Of course, there's no reason why a straight man couldn't perform that dance, but this was the early 20th century, and things simply weren't done that way. It wasn't just whilst treading the boards that Henry wanted to stand out. Offstage, his dress sense was outrageous, often accessorized with a glamorously groomed poodle. For some, it seemed obvious. Henry was gay. But, in truth, there's no real evidence to say he had any lovers, men or women. Some historians believe he was simply a pure narcissist, capable of only loving himself. Regardless, he was certainly unafraid to be himself and refused to be hemmed in by the strict norms of Victorian or Edwardian society, something that must have taken incredible courage. Don't forget, homosexuality was very much illegal in Britain at the time. After honing his on-stage craft by entertaining the Anglesey locals, Henry took his theatre company on a 3-year tour across the UK and Europe. There wasn't too much focus on financial returns, and it was more about putting on the best shows ever. To his credit, Henry took things pretty seriously, and he was said to be an accomplished actor. The touring company was made up of around 50 individuals, including actors, an orchestra, and support workers. They travelled with their own specially painted scenery and furniture, as well as elaborate costumes, all of which was transported in 5 large trucks. Henry also employed a personal staff of 4, and considering he made more costume changes than Beyoncé, they probably worked harder than anyone else in the company. It's not hard to imagine that the cost of running this theatre company, coupled with Henry's lifestyle in general, would eventually lead to dire monetary consequences. Initially, Henry started mortgaging his properties to make ends meet, but things snowballed pretty quickly with his unabated spending. By 1904, he'd accumulated debts of around £560,000, over £72 million today, and bankruptcy proceedings were started. With trustees in charge of Henry's financial affairs, everything went under the hammer at a series of auctions that would span 40 days. According to one newspaper, it was the most wonderful collection of clothing ever sold. And judging by most of the surviving pictures of Henry, it's hard to disagree with that one. All told, it took a good 40 days for the auctioneers to work their way through Henry's many possessions. 1 whole day was needed just to sell his huge collection of dogs, and it took more than several to work through his otherworldly collection of dressing gowns, furs, and over 900 silk-lined suits. For the most part, the auction was a roaring success. Henry's colossal jewellery collection fetched £80,000 alone, and by the time the hammer fell on the final lot, he was actually left in profit, which was provided for him in the form of an annual pension of £2,000 a year, or about £260,000 in today's money. Now, to the vast majority of us, that would still count as a huge fortune. More than enough to fund an extremely affluent lifestyle. It doesn't buy you all that many emerald ping pong jackets though, does it? According to one newspaper, Henry was so unhappy with his new, more modest circumstances that he concocted a plan to beat the house at the famous Monte Carlo casino. A plan that, you won't be surprised to hear, failed miserably. Henry's final curtain call came in the form of TB, and after a drawn-out illness, he passed away in the Monte Carlo hotel, with his estranged wife by his side. Without an heir or siblings, the title of marquess, and what was left of the family estate, were passed on to Henry's cousin, Charles Paget. Not that his family were in any way sad to see Henry go. Almost without exception, they were deeply ashamed of Henry. So much so that after his death, they did everything they could to erase him from their history, destroying almost all of his personal effects, including his diaries, letters, and any other traces of him. Henry's theatre became a chapel again, and all the other changes he'd made to the family's land and properties were undone one by one. The National Trust became the guardians of the family home in the 1970s. And for a long time, there were only a few photocopied pictures of Henry placed near a toilet. But in 2017, an iconic picture of Henry was used on the cover of a book which explored the National Trust's LGBT history. And the limelight returned to this flamboyant character. Thanks to his family's attempts to strike Henry from the history books, we're left with a bit of an enigma of a man. But Henry is finally starting to get some of the attention he craved in life. If you ask me, the world is a better place with crazy, extravagant people in it. And I like to think that if Henry was alive today, He'd be posting a ridiculously cheesy picture of himself on a beach at sunset, complete with the words, "If you're going to dance, then make sure everybody is watching, and give them a show they'll never forget." And unlike most people who post that crap, Henry would actually have the lifestyle to back it up. Thanks for watching.